Now, the massive Bombardier manufacturing facility in Thunder Bay that has built rail cars and transit systems for decades is shutting down and shifting operations south of the border. Devastation and disbelief in Thunder Bay. The Bombardier manufacturing plant is closing its doors forever. So this is what I think about Bombardier's decision. That's what they should face, and I think every Canadian should do the same thing. The community is furious over parent company Alstom's decision to relocate the manufacturing facility to the United States. An iconic Canadian industrial powerhouse just walked out the door, and the country still can't process what happened. Bombardier, the company that once stood as the backbone of Canadian manufacturing excellence, is now shifting its Thunder Bay operations across the border to the United States, leaving 550 workers without jobs and an entire region questioning its future. And instead of addressing the economic disaster that pushed the company away, Doug Ford is holding press conferences while the government scrambles for damage control. As if photo opportunities could rebuild an industrial base that took decades to establish. Major disruptions in Ontario's manufacturing sector. First, new environmental regulations are forcing increased compliance costs on heavy industry starting this quarter. And now a cornerstone manufacturing facility is permanently closing in Thunder Bay. The devastation began in Thunder Bay, a city that had anchored its economic identity around Bombardier's railcar manufacturing for over 4 decades. This wasn't just another factory in an industrial park. It was the economic heartbeat that supported mortgages, funded retirements, and created multi-generational employment stability. Then, without warning, the announcement landed like a bomb. The facility was shutting down permanently. 550 jobs were eliminated instantly, and all manufacturing operations were being transferred to facilities in New York State. No gradual transition, no retraining programs, just a locked gate and a community left to figure out survival on its own. Thunder Bay's second-largest private employer is vanishing. Alstom has confirmed it will permanently close the Bombardier Thunder Bay manufacturing facility, a plant that has been the industrial anchor of northwestern Ontario for nearly half a century, immediately terminating employment for 550 skilled workers. What makes this closure particularly devastating is that nothing was broken in the operation itself. The rail cars were selling, contracts were being fulfilled, and demand for transit systems continues growing globally. The workforce was skilled and productive. The only thing that changed was the harsh reality that Canada has transformed into one of the most punishing places in North America to operate heavy manufacturing. So now 550 families are being discarded. Not because they failed to perform, but because the regulatory and cost structure surrounding them made maintaining operations financially impossible. A city that once proudly proclaimed, "We build the trains that move the world," now has to watch that legacy disappear in corporate moving trucks. The Bombardier Thunder Bay facility you mentioned near the Great Lakes has been northwestern Ontario's manufacturing backbone, and industry analysts are pointing toward Canada's escalating operational costs as the primary driver behind the relocation decision. Bombardier didn't abandon Thunder Bay because demand collapsed or quality declined. It fled because Canada has systematically constructed one of the most hostile manufacturing environments in the developed world. Energy costs have skyrocketed beyond sustainability, carbon taxes continue expanding, and companies face an avalanche of environmental compliance requirements just to keep production lines running. Operating a heavy manufacturing facility here isn't just expensive anymore, it's become economically suicidal. Eventually, the mathematics became undeniable, and Bombardier did what every corporation does when facing extinction. It relocated to an environment where survival was actually possible. Alstom's parent company statement indicates this decision reflects their strategic realignment of North American manufacturing operations to optimize efficiency and position the company for sustainable long-term growth in competitive markets. Meanwhile, south of the border, the United States has systematically transformed itself into a manufacturing magnet over the past decade. Streamlined environmental approvals, competitive energy pricing, reduced regulatory complexity, and tax structures designed to encourage rather than penalize industrial investment. The kind of predictable business climate that allows companies to make long-term capital commitments with confidence. So when Bombardier's executives calculated they could reduce operational costs by approximately 35% simply by manufacturing in upstate New York instead of northwestern Ontario, the decision wasn't controversial internally. It was inevitable business logic. This represents a systemic economic failure, not an isolated corporate decision. And once a major manufacturer like Bombardier demonstrates the financial benefits of Exodus, other industrial operations won't hesitate to follow the same path. I made my position crystal clear to Alstom executives that they're going to face serious consequences for this decision, because essentially they delivered a form letter with no substantive explanation beyond claiming it was purely a business decision. You have entire family dynasties that have built their lives around this facility. When Alstom announced the closure, they carefully avoided calling it an abandonment or industrial flight. They labeled it operational optimization and strategic realignment. That's corporate speak for something much more straightforward. Our largest market access is through the United States, so we're transferring the jobs to the United States. The manufacturing, assembly, and logistics operations that sustained Thunder Bay for 4 decades will now be handled in facilities across New York State, where operational costs are significantly lower and regulatory compliance is manageable. Meanwhile, a skeleton crew will remain in Quebec to handle minimal Canadian market requirements, just enough to technically maintain some connection to Canadian operations. The announcement yesterday confirmed that the Thunder Bay Bombardier facility will cease all operations by March-off next year. Alstom, the French multinational that acquired Bombardier's transportation division, says after more than 4 decades of railcar manufacturing in northwestern Ontario. On paper, some engineering jobs might remain in Canada. In reality, the manufacturing paychecks and industrial base are gone forever. This is how multinational corporations exit without admitting they're fleeing. They package the decision in neutral corporate terminology: efficiency improvements, supply chain optimization, market positioning. While entire communities are expected to accept that their economic foundation was just a temporary business arrangement. The rail cars will maintain the same specifications, the contracts will be fulfilled on schedule, the Bombardier name will still appear on transit systems, but the skilled hands that once built them in Canada no longer have any role in that story. In Ontario, there are growing calls for a boycott of Alstom transportation contracts, though there are legitimate concerns that such actions could negatively impact remaining Canadian employees and supply chain partners in other provinces. The announcement struck deeper than a business headline. Bombardier has been woven into Canadian industrial identity for generations. In factory towns, at family dinner tables, in the quiet pride of knowing that Canadian-built transit systems operated in cities worldwide. The brand represented more than manufacturing capability. It embodied national industrial competence. So when the news broke that production was relocating south, communities didn't react to a corporate restructuring announcement. They reacted to a direct assault on their understanding of what Canada could build and maintain. Inside the facility, workers operated sophisticated railcar assembly lines, welding car bodies, installing electrical systems, and conducting quality control testing before completed units shipped to transit authorities across North America. A nation defines itself by what it can manufacture and retain. Losing a facility like Bombardier forces an uncomfortable recognition that industries once considered permanently rooted are now mobile. The type of skilled manufacturing employment that entire regions assumed would persist, communities built around technical expertise and long-term industrial careers, no longer exists with any guarantee. A symbol of Canadian manufacturing excellence is shifting its center of gravity to America, and people can sense the implications in that transition. Bombardier didn't decline or become obsolete. It simply evolved without Canada remaining central to its operational future. That quiet transformation reveals the actual trajectory of where the country's industrial capacity is headed. Expressing his outrage, Premier Doug Ford's media appearance was broadcast nationally. It functions as political theater in many ways. It generates compelling television coverage. What makes this situation even more infuriating is the scale of contracts Canada has provided. Ontario has been one of Alstom's most reliable revenue sources, with Metrolinx and other transit authorities purchasing hundreds of millions of dollars in rail cars and transportation systems annually. Bombardier wasn't a peripheral supplier. It was central to Canadian transit infrastructure, a dependable revenue stream built by Canadian taxpayers and Canadian workers who established that reputation through decades of reliable delivery and innovation. Ford's response potentially risks harming other Canadian workers. Alstom maintains significant operations in La Pocatière, Quebec, and has supplier relationships with Canadian firms across multiple provinces. Yet the decision to abandon Thunder Bay came down to approximately $12 million in annual operational savings. A community that provided the company with skilled labor, government support, and market access was reduced to a line item in a cost-cutting spreadsheet. Generations of expertise, community investment, and regional economic dependency were outweighed by a budget adjustment small enough to disappear in a quarterly earnings report. The message is unmistakable and impossible to soften. The workforce and operational environment were simply more expensive than alternatives. We need to manufacture these rail cars here in Ontario with Ontario workers. That's what we need to accomplish, supporting each other. You know what? I need to make this move even faster because it's not moving fast enough. I know the mayor wants to collapse right now. While Canada was implementing additional environmental regulations, increasing carbon tax rates, and introducing new layers of industrial compliance requirements, the United States was pursuing exactly the opposite approach. Over the recent years, the U.S. has constructed a manufacturing environment where production isn't just feasible, it's actively incentivized. Reduced corporate tax burdens, streamlined environmental approval processes, competitive energy costs, and a regulatory framework that treats heavy industry as strategic infrastructure to be protected rather than a problem to be managed. That's not ideological positioning. That's a measurable financial advantage that companies can quantify every quarter. I directly asked them, "How can you justify this decision to your largest Canadian customer?" I said, "What incentives could we provide to maintain these operations and preserve these jobs?" The response was definitive. "It's not negotiable." I said, "So the decision is final." That was the end of the conversation. When Alstom executives conducted their operational analysis, the comparison wasn't emotional or sentimental. It was mathematically decisive. On one side, a regulatory environment where compliance costs increase annually, approval processes extend indefinitely, and manufacturers are treated like environmental threats to be constrained. On the other side, a business climate specifically designed to attract manufacturing investment, reward expansion, and enable companies to scale operations without navigating bureaucratic obstacles at every decision point. The United States didn't poach Bombardier. It simply created conditions where relocating there became the rational business choice. This is the inevitable result when one country treats manufacturing growth as an environmental liability, while the other treats it as a national economic strategy. The border didn't shift. The competitive landscape did, and Bombardier followed basic business logic. This community depends entirely on this manufacturing facility. In Thunder Bay, the announcement didn't register as corporate news. It felt like the city's economic pulse stopping. The Bombardier facility wasn't just an employment site. It was the rhythm that structured daily life throughout northwestern Ontario. Entire extended families worked there, often spanning 3 generations of skilled trades. Paychecks from that plant funded home purchases, university educations, family vacations, and stable middle-class lives. It was the type of employer people assumed would always be there, providing security and continuity. Then, with a single corporate announcement, that assumption was obliterated. Workers left the final meeting in stages of shock. Some expressed anger, others remained silent, many were simply overwhelmed. Not because they couldn't understand market forces, but because they had believed their skill and loyalty created some form of mutual commitment. They weren't eliminated because of poor performance. They were eliminated because an algorithm determined someone elsewhere could perform the same work for less money. That facility served as the community's largest private employer, and observers are connecting this closure to broader trade tensions and manufacturing competitiveness issues. We must preserve these manufacturing jobs. Without this industrial base, we transform into just a residential community, and I, as mayor, refuse to accept that outcome. We're actively working to expand our commercial and industrial foundation. We've achieved significant progress this past year. The city now confronts a silence it has never experienced. The plant represented more than economic infrastructure. It was identity and purpose. The sounds of production shifts, equipment operation, transport trucks arriving and departing. That industrial noise confirmed to everyone that the community was economically alive and productive. Remove that activity, and what remains is a place forced to completely reinvent its reason for existence. This is the dimension of industrial closure that corporate press releases never acknowledge. When a major manufacturer departs, it doesn't just eliminate jobs, it eliminates the community's sense of purpose and economic identity. Approximately 70% of steel, aluminum, and specialized components used in Thunder Bay railcar production were sourced from Ontario suppliers and manufacturers across Canadian provinces. Could retaliatory measures actually backfire and harm other Canadian industrial operations? When the closure became public knowledge, the governmental response resembled political performance rather than economic leadership. Doug Ford appeared before media with industrial equipment, threatened to cancel future Alstom contracts, and announced he would pursue every legal option to hold the company accountable for the community impact. It was dramatic, highly visible, and designed to project strength and decisive action, but it didn't preserve a single job, prevent a single layoff, or modify a single corporate decision already finalized in executive boardrooms. The display generated favorable media coverage, but it failed to address the fundamental question every displaced worker was asking: what economic future do we have now? Simultaneously, Mark Carney offered no public response whatsoever. No policy explanation, no strategic framework, no acknowledgement of the broader economic implications unfolding across a region that had trusted the industrial policies he helped architect. One leader performing outrage without substance, another leader maintaining silence without accountability. Both responses highlighting the same core problem. There was never a comprehensive strategy to retain manufacturing competitiveness in the first place. Ontarians seeking to purchase Alstom transportation services and other related industrial products may soon encounter significant restrictions. The Premier indicates that excluding those companies from provincial procurement contracts represents the only available method to hold corporations accountable for job elimination decisions. The governmental reaction wasn't focused on addressing the underlying conditions that drove Bombardier away from Canada. It concentrated on punishing the corporation for making a rational business decision. That represents the fundamental issue. Instead of examining why manufacturers no longer consider Canada a viable location for investment, the government chose to perform public outrage and label it effective policy. It's politically easier to express anger on camera than to confront energy pricing, tax burdens, regulatory complexity, and the slow, systematic bureaucracy that has been suffocating industrial operations for years. The anger wasn't strategic or calculated. It was defensive posturing. It represented the response of a government surprised by a crisis it actively helped create through policy decisions. While Ford was threatening contract cancellations, not a single policy initiative was introduced to restore Ontario's manufacturing competitiveness. No plan to reduce operational costs for heavy industry. No discussion about accelerating approval processes. No commitment to streamline environmental compliance. Nothing that would make the next manufacturing company reconsider before relocating operations. Corporations are observing carefully, not the political theater, but the complete absence of substantive policy solutions. A message to all the executives at Alstom. I guarantee those transportation contracts are getting canceled from Ontario procurement when the last worker walks through that facility door for the final time. Meanwhile, the United States didn't need to steal Bombardier's operations. It simply maintained a regulatory and economic system where industrial expansion is encouraged rather than penalized. Corporations aren't motivated by sentiment or tradition. They relocate to jurisdictions where growth is supported and rewarded. Canada continues responding with emotional outbursts. America responds with competitive business incentives and rational policy frameworks. Mark Carney established his reputation as the strategic architect behind Canada's economic policy framework, the expert advisor who shaped industrial strategy and provided national economic direction. So when Bombardier announced its departure, when 550 workers faced unemployment, and when Thunder Bay confronted the loss of its primary industrial employer, people expected leadership and policy response. Instead, there was complete silence. The country's principal economic strategist simply withdrew from public discussion and allowed the silence to communicate his position. That silence reveals more than any public statement could convey. It demonstrates a policy framework that only functions during economic growth phases, not during industrial decline. It exposes leadership that participates in success celebrations and ribbon-cutting ceremonies, but disappears when communities face economic devastation. Carney architected an economic model that appeared functional in theoretical frameworks. But the moment it encountered competitive global pressures, the model failed, and he wasn't available to defend it or provide alternative strategies. Alstom directly employs more than 800 people across Canada while supporting approximately 12,000 jobs through distribution networks, supplier relationships, and the broader industrial and service sectors. Bombardier is not departing in isolation. It represents part of a comprehensive shift occurring throughout Canada's manufacturing sector. Companies involved in automotive production, aerospace manufacturing, heavy machinery assembly, and industrial processing have already begun relocating operations to the United States because the cost structures, regulatory environments, and operational efficiency are demonstrably superior there. The U.S. provides predictable regulations and competitive operational expenses, while Canada continues burdening manufacturers with delays, excessive overhead costs, and multiple layers of compliance requirements. Corporate executives don't debate loyalty or historical relationships. They analyze financial data and relocate accordingly. The immediate concern isn't the facility that just closed, but the manufacturing companies quietly evaluating whether they represent the next departure. Bombardier didn't initiate this trend. It confirmed and accelerated it. How Canada measures its trade relationship through what it imports versus what it exports. Currently losing $22.3 billion in Q2 alone. Ontario recently attempted to demonstrate strength in industrial policy by implementing new procurement requirements for foreign manufacturers, signaling control and leverage. Now the situation has completely reversed, with Bombardier transferring its manufacturing operations to the United States, the same market Ontario attempted to influence through policy pressure. The relocation exposes how limited Canada's actual leverage has become in the current economic environment. The province attempted to demonstrate it could influence corporate behavior and market decisions, but the market responded by relocating one of Canada's most significant manufacturing operations across the border. This wasn't a negotiation or compromise. It was a demonstration of who maintains the actual economic advantage in North American manufacturing competitiveness. Alstom represents far more than Thunder Bay's largest private employer to this Great Lakes community of approximately 110,000 residents. You have multiple generations of families that have built their careers there. Throughout the country, the reaction extends beyond anger into exhaustion and resignation. There's an expanding recognition that fundamental economic stability is shifting, that the elements Canadians historically relied upon, secure industrial employment, affordable living standards, a stable economic foundation, no longer exist with any certainty. The frustration isn't exclusively about Bombardier's departure. It's about what that decision represents and confirms. It signals that the country is systematically losing the industrial base that created its communities, and the political leadership appears incapable or unwilling to prevent that decline. The sentiment spreading through households across Canada is direct and overwhelming. If even Bombardier manufacturing is gone, what industrial capacity remains? If this analysis opened your perspective, don't let it end here. Hit like and smash subscribe.